Hey family, it's season 6 and it's been super exciting to bring Theology in 30 to our Hope TV platform. So let me start out by thanking Dr. E. Dewey Smith Jr. and our marketing and media team for the opportunity to bring Theology in 30 and this wonderful content to our Hope TV platform. So just to give you a little background, Theology in 30 was started on my personal platforms. I hosted it on Instagram and Facebook just to generate some dialogue around theology with my colleagues, my family, and people who are just curious about theology. So this opportunity is really exciting in so many ways. So I want to thank our supporters and our viewing audience who's been with us all this season and these couple of weeks. Thank you so much. So you know what I need you to do? I need you to talk to me in the comments. Let me know that you're here and where you're viewing us from. Also, listen, you can feel free to leave some questions in the chat. And our guest for today, I'm not going to spoil it, but our guest for today and myself will try to answer those questions live while you are watching us. So another thing that I want to share is that we want to grow our viewing audience. So I need your help. Viewing audience, I need you all to do two things. Follow us on Instagram at the Hope TV, and then if you would please share our link from our page to yours so that others can enjoy this great content. Can y'all do that for me? Thank you. Thank you. So just to introduce today's show, when I was growing up, I really didn't see a lot of female preachers, especially not on a consistent basis. And so I remember growing up in Macon, Georgia, and hearing preachers like Dr. Carolyn Ann Knight and a local preacher who was very influential in my just forming of my homiletical theory was Dr. Loretta Williams. She's gone home to be with the Lord, but she was just an amazing, very energetic preaching woman. And so both of these women, when I would hear them, I felt like they were so relevant. It was almost as though they knew my story. And so that was very powerful for me. And so when I went to Candler School of Theology, I was blown away because I met Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, who is the Bandy Chair of Homiletics there. And our guest today, this is the tie-in. She's a Candler alum as well, whose pedagogy and scholarship have blown me away once again at CTS as my womanist preaching professor. Dr. Courtney V. Buggs is the assistant professor of homiletics and the assistant director of the PhD program in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric. She says that she likes being a part of a theological community that is committed to a godly witness in the world, and she enjoys working with colleagues who have welcomed her giftings and skills. She's proud to have followed her passion to serve in the U.S. Air Force, and now she follows her passion to lead and teach in theological education. Listen, I can speak on her behalf. She's an incredible professor, preacher, and assistant program director, and I know that our conversation today is going to be engaging. Join me in welcoming our guest on Theology in 30 for today, Dr. Courtney V. Buggs.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pastor Jennifer, for that introduction.
So it's an honor to have you, and I don't want to waste any of our time. So I'm just going to jump right in. The first question is around how you formed your homiletical theory, because you already know what I'm going to talk about. We were in class, and you whipped out this diagram that changed everybody's life and that gave everybody life back. So I want to ask you, what do you love most about your practice of preaching?
What do I love most about my practice of preaching? I would say I love the ability to bring together all of the communities that have formed me. And what I mean by that is there are some who are formed in one particular tradition or a particular way of preaching or understand preaching in a particular way. That is not my testimony. That is not my story. I was shaped by many different communities, and I appreciate being able to live out all of those communities just by being myself and not trying to fit into a certain space or a certain way, but just by being myself.
Absolutely. I mean, I've always said that in preaching specifically, your authenticity is an asset for you because your experiences, you bring all of that to the preaching moment. And there's someone who's had similar experiences and can relate to you. So I love that about your preaching. I've heard you before, And so I see that authenticity in the way that you preach. So you've been also working in ministry as well. And so I want to ask, what are some experiences throughout your ministry that have affirmed that call, that call to preaching, that call to teaching? What experiences can you look back on and say, I knew that I was doing what I was destined or created to do when this happened?
Sure, it's a great question. I think it serves all of us when we are willing to look back and just kind of observe over time. And I would suggest first that I don't come from a family of preachers. I don't come from what I often hear African American preachers talk about, their legacy of preaching. I don't come from any of that. I come from a hunger for God. That is what fueled or even began my place in ministry, was just a hunger for God. I didn't even know that this kind of language about call as I was beginning to walk in a call. I can remember being in high school, and the pastor that I was with at that time asked me, "Have you considered going to seminary?" And I remember saying, "No." I was thinking, I don't even know that word, and I'm going to be an engineer. And that's exactly what I did. But what I didn't foresee is that even as I went on to university, I began to live out the very call that he was talking about, that other people kept seeing, that I didn't understand, through leading our university gospel choir, teaching Bible studies, and campus crusade for Christ. Just I was just following God. I wasn't following some kind of title. So it wasn't until I finished undergraduate and ended up joining a what would be considered a denominational church that I sort of started to understand, oh, this is like a form that people do, and they follow some kind of process, and was later licensed, and then in some years later ordained. So the my pathway to preaching, I would suggest, began with others seeing the call more than me saying, "Hey, I'm called." That came much later, as I, observe, wow, when I do this, this is how people respond, or somehow I get called to these situations or asked to preach, though I've never identified myself as a preacher. So there were multiple, many times I could count, of things like that. And then as time went on, I began to sense this is really what God has for me. I don't necessarily call it a thing, but clearly it has been called a thing. So I'll stop right there. Yeah, that's a little, I think sometimes we look at calls as if they only happen in one way, but sometimes people are just following God. And and continuing to follow God. I would say that's still what I'm doing. I'm just continuing to follow God.
Listen, and it comes across in your preaching. I was just kind of taking mental notes when you were speaking. I love what you said when you said you were just following God. And in your following
Yeah.
God, that led you to the call. You weren't looking for titles. And you know, this is Theology in 30. So we're very transparent here in this space. We know that there are some people who look at preaching and say, oh, it looks glamorous. I want to do that. I
Yeah.
want to be on the stage. But it sounds to me, and I think this comes through in your preaching, that that was never your intent. It was never anything you were looking for. And as I view your preaching and your ministry, it comes across so real and so authentic, as if you didn't have to be up here in front of all these people, you probably wouldn't. So that's how you know that God is leading you to do it. And I can relate to that. I've told people often that I'm kind of in my head for the most part, kind of introverted. So when I'm preaching, that's the only time you see a big personality for the most part. That's the only time you really see a lot of energy from me in that way. So I'm grateful that you've shared that. So I'm in the Dr. Frank Thomas School of this idea of moral imagination in our preaching. That our preaching should call people to a place of being better, of acting in ways that are transformative, uh, caring for those who are in need. I just think that preaching should not just be about the preacher. It shouldn't be about us, but it should move the audience to become better and to do something more verdant in the world. And so I want to talk to you about your theology of preaching, because I think for me, this whole uh, I was going to talk about Isaac Rufus Clark. You know, that was probably, that was where I was going next. But the proposition is important for me. And that's a part of how I frame my theology and preaching. God loves
Mhm.
us unconditionally. And because God loves us, this is the way we act in the world. So I say all of that to ask you, what's your theology of preaching? And is there a central theological claim that shows up again and again in your preaching?
I wouldn't say that there is a single claim, but I would say that one of my deepest theological convictions is that God is at work in the world. And so much of my preaching, whether implicit or explicit, revolves around the idea that God is active in the world and God does what God does through us. And so leaning into what does it mean to be agents of God in the world and changing the world for the better. There's lots of ways to talk about that, but in essence, that probably shows up over and over again. This notion that no, I'm not thinking about a distant Jesus. I'm not thinking about the historical Jesus. I'm thinking about Emmanuel, God present with us now.
Please send us relief, oh God. Lord, Lord. I want to encourage everyone that has new music out or has new music coming out to not be grand. Get out there and work. If Mary still have to promote a record, if Kirk Franklin still has to promote a record, you do too. So get out there and grind and don't wait for it. Don't wait for it to come to you. Go get it. There's space for all of us. Just like a river now. Made God our heart. Made God our heart. Tell somebody.
My Shiro doesn't always wear a cape, but she always has time for a hug, a smile, for going the extra mile. My Shiro stretches every dollar, puts in long hours, puts others first. But now it's your time, Mom. When you're ready to retire, we want you to be able to enjoy it. It's time to start saving now. A free 3-minute online chat can give you the personalized tips you need to start boosting your retirement savings today. Visit aceyourretirement.org/Shiro.
You said that so eloquently. It's moments like this that I'm humbled and I realize that I'm a budding scholar because of just how you framed that. And so that really is a beautiful lead in to our next question, which is about difficult text. A couple of months ago, I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Russell and in a Hebrew Bible course. And we had an activity with the students, or we led them through an activity where they looked at texts that challenged them, texts that were difficult, like Jephthah's daughter. We looked at some texts that are really violent and difficult to read, difficult to hear, and figuring out, how do we present this? How do we teach this? How do we preach it? And one thing that I've noticed about you is that you are not afraid of preaching a difficult text. So I want you to help our viewing audience, those who may be preachers, those who just may be students, those who may be curious. How do you address text when you see something in there that you don't even, that does not align with how you understand the grace of God, or how you understand God's activity in the world, or just in general. How do you deal with difficult text? I'm going to leave it there because we can go on and on.
Right. Well, I want to answer that in two ways. The first way I want to respond to that is understanding your own preaching identity. I think what often happens is we understand preaching as if it's all the same, and I would argue that it's not all the same. The role of a pastor is a senior pastor, let me say it that way, is different from the role of an associate. It's different from the role of other staff pastors. It's different from the role of that I have when I show up in preaching context as a scholar practitioner, not as a practitioner scholar. So, because I preach in lots of different contexts, not consistently, just in different spaces, literally all the time.
Itinerant? Yeah.
Yes, this idea of itineracy, to me, that's a different kind of preaching than a pastor who is preaching Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, a few guests here and there. I'm one of those few guests that gets tossed in here and there. But preaching at its best, I would suggest, shifts consciousness. It raises consciousness. And this does not happen in one sermon. This happens in preaching over time. This is the work of local ministry. This is not the work of a person like me who is an itinerant, who shows up, just to preach whatever this day is that you've asked me to come in. So, my two part is the first piece is I think it's important to understand who you are in that space. And so I don't go in thinking that I'm going to tackle some very different, difficult subject or text or event in the world in one preachment. What I actually am going to do is do damage. And I'm not interested in doing damage.
Come on.
If it's a subject
Yeah.
that it's real clear, this is not going to be argued or resolved in one preachment, that's probably not what I'm going to do, unless I've been specifically asked to talk about that. And I can say that's very rare, because I don't believe that that's how preaching functions. It happens over time. So that's the first thing, is really recognizing who you are as a preacher and what you're called to do in the space that you're called to do. I am called to bring insights in literature and in avenues of interpretation that might not have been considered, but not necessarily to tackle very difficult things that aren't going to get illuminated in one setting. So that's the first response. More directly to your question, how do I handle difficult texts? I would say I don't know that there's anything special. I sit with them and wrestle with them just like everyone else. And if I find that there is no resolution that seems to be a resolution, I name that in the text. I name it. So I don't try to fix it. I don't try to resolve it. Just recently, I was preaching last week's lectionary text at a church on Sunday, which was the love your enemies text. And if you only
Yes.
love the people who you love, what benefit is that? If you only loan to those who you think are going to give your money back, what benefit is that? That's not what Jesus has called for. It was difficult to preach this in a location I've never been there. Large, very large,
Mm-hmm.
white congregation. And so I
Wow.
settled with, if I can share with you, the title of the sermon was
Yeah.
It's Hard to Imagine. And so I walked through this community that Jesus is, or not even this community, this ethic that Jesus is trying to promote. And I took it to, it's hard for me to imagine because this is so different from the world that we live in. But with God,
Mm.
all things are possible. So I wrestled with that. I'm not going to preach the whole sermon, but so that's my
Listen,
way of
take.
accepting.
I was gonna say, take your time. Take your time. It's all right.
But this was
But
my
yes.
way of conveying to the congregation this is a difficult text. And the comments after the service were that very statement. Dr. Bugs, that was a difficult text. That is difficult to hear. That is difficult to sit with. Where my goal for that sermon was that, to say this is hard. We're not excused from it, but this is really hard. So
You
sometimes it's
have
not just the texts that are um, uh, visibly difficult, such as, Jephthah's daughter, something like that. Sometimes it's our Christian shaping and forming that's very difficult to live out. It's easy to say it. It's very difficult
mm,
to live it.
listen, I told our Theology in 30 audience that this conversation was going to be engaging, but I almost want to do an altar call after that, because that is the goal of preaching for me, especially when we talk about, in my context, African American preaching, Black preaching, and sacred rhetoric. That's the goal, to get us to a place where it's the gospel and we are called to live this out. So I think you said something really powerful in that statement. So you brought up something really good, and it's not on our list, but I hope it's okay if I ask this question. Is there a way to be consistent, though, in your theology in an itinerant context? So if you're preaching on the road, you can still be consistent, right?
My response is yes, you can be consistent. And again, I say understanding what your role is when you go to the various places that you may go. And I'll add to that, first century preachers, they pull the time. So that's a kind of, you have a particular theological assumptions and impetus that kind of drive preaching. There are other itinerant preachers who do not preach consistently like that, or even associates and assistants. That's a different way of being. It's not, because you don't have that rhythm. So you have to find, and this is a whole nother conversation. I went to it, but you have to find what it is and how it is that you shape your preaching when you're one of those preachers that is not preaching all the time. That's a whole different conversation. I won't even go down that path. I will say I'm
Yes.
writing about that right now.
Well, I appreciate your work, and I'm looking forward to reading it, because it's really something that those of us who dabble in both, right? As an executive pastor, I do have opportunities where I may teach a noonday Bible study, and that'll be an assignment that I complete every week, sitting with that audience. So my messages may be a little pastoral with that audience, especially if we developed a rapport. So a part of that informs what I'm preaching as an itinerant minister. But I just think your work is going to help a lot of us, because we're all trying to figure out that dynamic.
Where do you think the root of problems lie when it comes to creating stable, loving relationships?
You attract basically who you are. So if you want to attract a better partner, become a better person. And if I'm grinding, setting myself for building my family wealth, generational wealth, it would be not right for me to be with someone who actually has a spending problem.
Well, you better. Yes, sir.
Honey, what I think you need is a socket wrench.
I played JV basketball.
I'm sorry. I don't think it looks right.
This is good, and it's all good, baby.
Is it really all good?
If you love me enough to routinely test your handyman skills, not to mention the strength of your marriage, then of course you'll visit nhtsa.gov/the-right-seat to make sure I'm in the right car seat.
I'm gonna call my dad.
There's a decline in blood donations. Talk to us about why should we give blood?
When you donate, you save 3 lives. So I think this is a great thing, like your platelets, your whole blood, and your plasma is split up. So it's not going directly to one patient, but it's actually being split up and it's going to 3 different patients.
I want to move to another question. Is there a time in your preaching ministry where, and I think your last story kind of falls into this, but I want to see if there's something even more, I guess, extreme, where you sermon and afterwards you felt like, I don't know if I not that if you did well, but I don't know if it was my best work. Let's start there, or the best that you could. Some people enjoy it, but in our hearts, we're kind of like, I could have said this differently. Have you ever had uncomfortable feelings, is what I'm asking, after you preached a sermon, whether it was you left something out, or there was another truth that you didn't expose that you wish you should have, just different feelings. There's so many nuances to that. But is there a story like that that you can share with our newbies, new preachers, or people who are just curious who are watching?
Yes, I would say I probably feel like that every single time I preach.
Me
It never
too. Me too.
feels complete. I always have something I coulda. But there is the grace of God that covers others and covers people's ears, and they hear what they need to hear, even when we feel inadequate and when we feel our work is insufficient. Somehow God does what God does. Um, if I could point to a particular story, the truth is I would point to lots of my early preaching, when there were
Mm.
times when I tried to tackle subjects that I was not ready to tackle. And sometimes I was already out there trying to have a conversation that in reality I did not have the depth to have, and I should have just stayed in the water that I was comfortable swimming in. So sometimes these are complex issues. It could be abortion. It could be at that time, well, I guess in some
Mm.
ways now too, conversations around sexuality, conversations around gender, and stepping into these waters when you're not really ready to fully explore whatever it is that you're exploring. And now I'm not thinking about my time as an itinerant. In my earlier years, I was actually a pastor. And so there were these years where I'm trying to deal with these issues, and maybe I wasn't quite ready to deal with some of them. So when I look back, there are some things that I wish I would have had the confidence to just wait and preach what you know, not what you want to know, or just preach what you know. And over time, you're going to know more. Over time, you will have more experience rather than trying to preach out of an experience that is not your own. As one who's preached a while now and now listens to lots of preaching, I can tell when people are preaching out of their depth. I can tell when they're trying to wow us with their gifting, but I know they haven't been through anything.
So hearing you say that has ignited a question in me, and this is the part of Theology in 30 that I like the least when we're coming down to the end. But I gotta ask this question before we end. All right, as a budding professor, budding scholar, budding homiletician, you being someone who has been a professor for a while now, much longer than I, will I ever be able to just enjoy a sermon? Or will I always be thinking about, are they working from existential tools? Or will I always be thinking about which biblical criticism is this person using? Or will I be thinking they're not preaching out of their depth? I mean, I've because I'm learning all of this, when I hear a sermon, all of these thoughts start coming into my mind about everything that we're learning as we're studying preaching. There's one thing to preach and another thing to study preaching. And so I just want to know from you, is there light for me at the end of the tunnel? Or will I always be dissecting sermons until I go home to be with the Lord?
Yes, and yes. Yes, there is light. I learned, or maybe this is just part of who I am. I worship God And so even in class, today when I finish this call, I've got sermons to listen to. And I tell the students right up front, I am here to listen to see what God has to say. So the first time I'm listening, I am listening as a worshiper. I know that I have to go back and grade that sermon, but I don't want students thinking about that. And so I'm the same way if I go to church. If I'm going virtual or not virtual, it doesn't really matter. I'm a worshiper first. And so I'm thinking about, what does God have to say to my life? I may be a professor, but I'm still a human being in this world that's got to navigate how I live out my faith. So I'm listening for God, is what I'm listening for first.
I
Thereafter,
love it. So, yes,
there are times
yes.
when I think to myself, that could have been said in 20 minutes, though it took 40. I'm not going to deny there are absolutely the times I'm saying that. There are times when in the middle of the sermon, I'm thinking, what is your claim? I don't know where this is going. I try not to do that because I want to worship first. So, yes, there is a place, I think, you can escape this assessment, if you will. And at the same time, there is a part of you, because it's what you do, that it creeps up, it calls your attention, and people are forever asking me, what did you think? Can you give me feedback? So some of it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with other people who want me to give them feedback. And so I listen so that I can give them feedback.
That is so powerful. I'm going to let you have our parting words because everything you've said so far, I think, has been very helpful for our viewing audience and then personally helpful for me as well. So I want to share that. Thank you for all that you've shared during our time together today. For those of us who are studying rhetoric or studying preaching, it's so good to hear somebody with a reminder or to share a reminder that we are worshipers first. I love that. So I just hope our viewing audience got that. I just wanted to repeat that it doesn't matter how many degrees you got, how long you've been preaching, whether you're a professor or whether you're the chair of a department or whatever you're doing, you're a worshiper first. I think that's going to be our little phrase for this episode. So let me bounce it back to you. In your parting words, will you share with us how we can support your scholarship, or is there anything you want us to know about what you're doing right now?
Not yet. My works are in progress. I'll say that. So there is some things coming out, but it takes a minute. It's not overnight. So probably for parting words, I would just like to share to all preachers, all those who are maybe even don't call yourself a preacher, you're just doing the work. Just be yourself. Just be yourself. You are not a preacher to everybody. Some people will like you. You're preaching, others will not. It doesn't really matter. God has those who are attuned to your voice. So let your voice be present. And yeah, just be yourself. I think that's the most important thing that I think is important for preachers. Sometimes that means unlearning who we have learned to be from other people. Learn to be you, and that will show up in your preaching.
Wow, you've given us so much to live into today that I have nothing else to say. I'm just going to end it on that note. Be yourself. Listen, don't try to mimic anybody else. God has given you a unique gift. Dr. Bug said, I'm going to free you up today. Just do you. Again, this is the House of Hope. Dr. E. Dewey Smith Jr. is our pastor. Our guest for today was Dr. Courtney V. Buggs, and she was amazing. We believe here at the House of Hope that life with God is better in every way, every day. And we want to thank you for joining us today for Theology in 30. Now, I'm not going to spoil it and tell you who's coming next week. You just got to tune in and see. So we'll see you next week for another episode of Theology in 30. Be safe, family.